What would you do if someone built a gate on your lake 2 days after you bought it? I had barely bought my lake in Wyoming, hadn't even set down my first fishing chair, when the HOA built a gate, slapped on a community access sign, and marched down like they owned the shoreline. They claimed the lake had always been theirs, but the quieter I stayed, the clearer it became. If I didn't stand my ground, they'd turn my lake into their amenity. And then the truth started rising to the surface. The morning I discovered the gate, the Wyoming air was still cold enough to sting the back of my throat. A thin band of mist hovered above the lake, my lake, catching the first hints of sunlight as it rolled off the ridge. I stood at the edge of the gravel path with my hands in my jacket pockets, breathing in the quiet that had been the reason I bought this place in the first place. Quiet was rare these days. Peace was rarer. That's why the sight in front of me hit like a wrong note played too loud in a familiar song. A brand new wooden gate, fresh-cut pine, still pale from the sawmill, had been drilled directly into the soil near the waterline. The posts were sunk deep, braced with galvanized brackets, and a crossbar ran between them like a challenge. And right in the center, flapping slightly in the breeze, was a laminated sign that read in bold blue letters, Community Access, Willow Bay, HOA. The words didn't make sense at first. My brain refused to place them together. Community Access, HOA. On the land I had closed on barely 48 hours ago. I walked closer, each step crunching over frost-stiffened grass. The morning light bounced off the lake just beyond the gate, the surface rippling gold and silver like it always did at sunrise. That view was supposed to be mine alone, one of the few things in life that didn't require negotiation or compromise. But there it was, a gate I hadn't built, a sign I hadn't approved, a boundary drawn by someone else's hand. A truck sat off to the side, backed halfway onto the property, as if whoever parked it believed the right to be there came preloaded with the ignition key. It was a white HOA-branded pickup, the type with a yellow strobe on top and a clipboard sitting on the dashboard. Mud clung to the tires, still damp, leaving a clear trail from the subdivision path onto the soft earth near the water. The smell of churned-up soil mixed with the crisp scent of the lake, an unwelcome intrusion in a place that had always smelled clean. I took another step forward and ran my gloved fingers over the wood. Smooth, untouched. Recently installed. Someone hadn't just wandered onto my land. They'd taken their time, measured, planned, brought tools. No note, no courtesy call, no knock on the door. Just a gate announcing itself like it belonged. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of distant traffic from the highway and the soft slap of tiny waves against the rocky shoreline. It should have calmed me, but it didn't. My stomach tensed in that slow, steady way it does when something is wrong, but the wrongness hasn't shown its full shape yet. I leaned back, taking in the whole picture. The lake stretched out wide, framed by evergreens and rolling hills, the reflection of the sky shifting from soft lavender to blue, the stillness that made the world feel like it was holding its breath. And then that gate. That ridiculous, out-of-place gate forcing itself into the frame like an uninvited extra in a quiet scene. Who in their right mind would think this was their place to build? I took one long breath, then let it out. The cold made it look like steam drifting upward, dissolving into the air, just as quickly as it formed. Something about this wasn't just a misunderstanding. People don't haul lumber and dig post holes because of confusion. They don't put their truck on someone else's soil unless they believe, fully, without question, that they have a right to be there. But I had closed on this lake fair and square. I'd read every line of the deed myself, then read it again just to be certain. My family had owned ranch land across 3 states. Paperwork was something I trusted more than promises. So how did an HOA get the idea that my lake was theirs? I stepped back from the gate and looked at the lake again. It shimmered like nothing had happened, like the world was still fine. But I wasn't fine. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out, breaking the silence. The gate stood firm, its sign rattling lightly in the wind. "Community access," it announced, as if repeating the lie might make it true. I wiped my palm against my jeans and felt the first flicker of irritation settle into something sharper. Something that didn't like being pushed. Something that had been quiet too long. Someone had crossed into my land. Someone thought they could claim what wasn't theirs. And as I stood there on the cold Wyoming ground, watching the gate sway against the rising wind, a single question lodged itself in my mind. Heavy, unwelcome, and impossible to ignore. Who gave them the right to touch my lake? A crunch of gravel behind me broke the silence. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Heels, not boots. The kind of footsteps that didn't belong out here, on this rough lakeside soil. I turned, already knowing this wasn't going to be a friendly introduction. A woman stood by the HOA truck, one hand on her hip, the other clutching a clipboard like it was a badge of authority. Her blonde hair was pulled back tight, the kind of style that suggested she didn't like being argued with. A pale pink jacket draped over her shoulders, thin for the cold morning, but clearly chosen for presentation rather than practicality. "Morning," she said, though her tone made it sound like an accusation. "You must be the new owner." I didn't move. "I am." She took a few steps closer, the wind tugging at the hem of her jacket. "I'm Bethany Reed, president of the Willow Bay Homeowners Association." She said it like the title should mean something to me. "We've been expecting you to introduce yourself." "Funny," I said. "I wasn't expecting anyone to build a gate on my land." Her eyes flicked to the gate, then back to me. The faintest smile curled at the corner of her mouth. Not warm, not apologetic. More like someone annoyed they'd been caught doing something they didn't think they needed permission for. "Oh, that," she said breezily. "Yes. Well, the community has always had access to this lake. It's considered an amenity of Willow Bay." My jaw tightened. The deed says otherwise. Bethany raised her clipboard like she were conducting a ceremony. "Well, maybe legally, the lake isn't listed inside the subdivision, but it's always been treated as part of Willow Bay. Residents fish here, launch their kayaks, hold holiday events. It's tradition." I stared at her. "Tradition doesn't equal ownership." She gave a little laugh, the kind people use when they want you to know they aren't taking you seriously. "Oh, I'm sure you're just unfamiliar with how things work around here. New owners usually are. But this lake has always been ours, at least in practice. You bought the water, yes, but the community's relationship with it is long-standing." The wind kicked up, sweeping cold air across the surface. Her jacket ruffled, but she didn't flinch. Her confidence was unnerving. Too polished, too rehearsed, like she'd given this speech before. I stepped forward until we were eye to eye. "Bethany, the lake came with the land. It's private property. That gate shouldn't be here." Her chin lifted a fraction, challenging me. "With all due respect, Remy, you may own the lake on paper, but this community has used it for over a decade. And under Willow Bay bylaws, established community amenities can't be revoked without due notice and a transition period." I blinked. "I'm not part of your HOA. My land isn't part of your subdivision." "That's your interpretation," she said lightly. "Interpretation?" Heat crept up my neck. "Do you have any legal document showing access rights? Easements? Easement by necessity? Anything?" The smile finally faded. She didn't like being pressed. "We have bylaws and precedent." "Precedent isn't ownership." Her clipboard snapped shut. The sound cracked in the cold air like a warning shot. "Remy, look. No one wants trouble. But the residents expect to use this lake. They paid for a lifestyle when they bought their homes. And I paid for the lake when I bought it." "Yes," she said slowly, like explaining a complex idea to a child. But the community paid for the expectation of access. There it was, the real belief behind all of this. Not law, not rights, expectation. A sense of entitlement wrapped in polite language. The wind blew stronger now, rippling the water and rattling the sign on the gate. Behind her, another car pulled up, a silver SUV with 2 HOA board members stepping out. One held another clipboard. The other looked exhausted, as if he regretted waking up this morning. Bethany didn't look back. She didn't need an audience to perform. "This lake," she said firmly, "is part of Willow Bay identity. Always has been. And we intend to maintain access for our residents." My pulse steadied, cold and slow. "On private land you don't own." She ignored the comment. "We'll need to coordinate schedules for maintenance, water testing, and community events. Communication is key. I trust you'll be cooperative." "Cooperative?" I repeated. "You built a gate on my property without asking." She lifted a brow. "Temporary measure. We assumed you'd understand once we explained. It's always been ours." The wind carried the sharp scent of lake water between us, cold enough to sting. I followed her gaze back to the gate I never approved, never wanted, never asked for. A gate proclaiming ownership not backed by a single legal fact. I looked back at her, at the clipboard, the posture, the entitlement carved into every syllable she spoke. Something inside me hardened, the same way frozen soil does before winter truly sets in. I took a step closer. "If you believe that, Bethany, what exactly do you think happens next?" She held my stare, unblinking, as the morning sun broke over the ridge and lit the lake like a sheet of fire. Then she smiled, a thin, practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "What happens next," she said softly, "is whatever the community decides." She turned away and walked back toward the truck, heels snapping sharply against the gravel. The other board members fell in behind her. The truck door slammed shut. The engine turned over with a growl. They left the gate behind, swaying slightly in the rising wind, like it belonged to them. But the land beneath it belonged to me. And I had a feeling this was only the first move. I learned just how right I was 3 days later, on a Saturday morning so still and glassy that the lake looked like a sheet of polished silver. I'd gotten used to waking up early out here. Wyoming mornings demand attention, but nothing prepared me for what I saw when I stepped out onto my porch with a cup of black coffee in hand. Color. Too much of it. Bright kayaks, red, yellow, neon green, lined up along my shoreline like someone had opened a rental shop overnight. The crisp air carried the squeak of rubber soles, the splash of paddles, and the kind of laughter people reserve for places they think belong to them. The cold morning breeze pushed the sound across the water, carrying it all the way up to the porch where I stood, rooted. For a moment I simply blinked, my brain refusing to accept the sight. A group of teenagers hauled a cooler onto the gravel path. A couple in matching windbreakers unstrapped their inflatable paddleboards near a patch of reeds I'd hoped would stay untouched. A man set up a folding table, brushed snow dust off the top, and started arranging paper plates. Someone dragged a portable grill to the water's edge. My water's edge. I felt the sharp sting of cold in my chest, a heavier version of the morning air. It wasn't anger yet, not quite. More like disbelief wearing the mask of irritation. Bethany's words echoed in my mind. The community expects to use this lake. Now I saw exactly what she meant. I set my coffee down on the wooden railing, walked down the porch steps, and followed the crunch of gravel toward the water. The air smelled wrong, sharper, busier. Lake mornings were supposed to smell like damp earth, pine needles, and cold stone. Today it smelled like sunscreen and charcoal. The first footprints appeared 20 feet from the porch. Muddy impressions, not from boots, but from sneakers, dozens of them, leading to the lake. The soil was churned up all along the bank, soft and dark where the frost had melted under so many feet. It looked like the aftermath of a school field trip, not the quiet lakeside I had expected when I signed the deed. I stood near the gate. The sign still hung crooked in the wind, but now it seemed to glare at me, matching the bold voices of the crowd. "Morning!" a woman called cheerfully, adjusting her life vest. She didn't wait for an answer. A kid sprinted past me with a fishing rod twice his height, kicking gravel as he went. His father jogged after him, calling, "Don't tangle the line this time." A family set up lawn chairs right against the waterline, my waterline, facing the lake like it was their annual summer escape. My fingers curled around the fence post. The wood was cold, grounding me. Every instinct I had wanted to tell them to pack up and leave, but instinct wasn't how these things were won. Sarah always said, "You don't stop trespassers with a raised voice. You stop them with records." So I forced myself to breathe. Slow, even. Let them trespass. Let them show their patterns. Then one more thought struck me, clearer than the rest. This wasn't improvisation. This was coordinated. Someone had told them the lake was open. Not suggested, not implied, told. I stepped back from the gate and crossed to my truck, the gravel shifting under my boots. Behind the seat, I kept a small case with 2 trail cameras I used during hunting season. They were good ones, infrared, motion-activated, with time-stamped recording. I grabbed both, along with the metal straps they came with. I walked the perimeter of the shoreline, placing one camera high in a ponderosa pine that overlooked the lake. The other I strapped to a fence post facing the path from the subdivision, angled just right to capture whoever crossed onto my property. The cold metal bit at my fingers as I tightened the last screw. By the time I finished, a group had already dragged a portable speaker near the gate. Soft pop music floated across the water, mixing with splashes and shouts. None of them spoke to me now. They moved around me like I was part of the scenery, an inconvenient boulder standing in the wrong place. They didn't ask permission. They didn't acknowledge ownership. They simply behaved like everything around them was theirs by default. A man in his late 50s paddled in on a bright orange kayak, cruising right up to my dock. He waved at the camera I'd placed earlier, as if posing for a family portrait. His smile lingered for a long, awkward second, as though he enjoyed the idea of being watched. I memorized his face. The emotion that rose in me wasn't anger. Not yet. It was something colder, a narrowing of focus, a calculation. I stepped back, letting space grow between me and the crowd, until their voices faded into the rest of the lake's morning noise. The water rippled softly against the shore, carrying the distant thump of paddles. The sky had brightened to a pale winter blue, brushing the tops of the trees with light. It wasn't the day I wanted. It wasn't the lake I imagined. But it was information. And information was leverage. I raised my collar against the wind, walked back up to the porch, and retrieved my coffee. It had gone cold, but the bitterness tasted honest. Behind me, a child's laughter echoed across the lake, high and carefree. The sound carried on the breeze, brushing against my shoulders like an unwelcome reminder. They thought they belonged here. They thought this lake was theirs. And as I watched another kayak push into the water, leaving neat ripples in the morning sheen, one thing became painfully, unmistakably clear. My silence wasn't stopping anything. My patience wasn't slowing them down. They were getting bolder by the hour. And if this was how they behaved on day 3, I could only imagine what day 4 would bring. I didn't have to imagine long. The next morning arrived colder than the last, the sky a pale wash of gray that promised snow by evening. I stepped outside with a steaming mug in hand, hoping the quiet dawn might reset something inside me. But the moment I reached the edge of the porch, I saw it, glinting against the muted light, catching the breeze like a metal tongue announcing a lie. A new sign. This one wasn't laminated plastic. It was a professionally pressed aluminum sheet, reflective, weatherproof, bolted directly into the wooden gate as if someone wanted to etch their authority into the very grain. I walked toward it slowly, the cold crunch of frost beneath my boots loud in the silence. The letters were hard to miss. HOA Public Access. Violators fined. Below it, the Willow Bay HOA logo, a mountain silhouette over rippling blue lines meant to represent water. My water. My lake, branded as if it were a public swimming hole owned collectively by people who hadn't even bothered to read the county plat map. I swallowed the rest of my breath before it escaped as a curse. The bolts were fresh, edges still silver, unclouded by moisture. The sign hadn't been there long. Someone had gotten up early, driven onto my land, and installed this before sunrise. The truck tires had left trails in the dew-darkened grass, clear as fingerprints. I crouched and examined the ground. The tracks came from the same direction as before, the trail that led up from the subdivision. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't miscommunication. It was a message. I straightened up slowly, letting the cold bite into my lungs. The air smelled like wet pine and metal. That smell stuck with me. Metal. Like the scent of something forged without permission. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. I took photos. Lots of them. Wide shots of the gate, close-ups of the bolts, angled shots that captured the tracks zigzagging across the damp ground. Every image stitched a story together, one someone else had thought I wouldn't bother to tell. Not only had they continued trespassing, they were escalating. I stepped back to take one more picture when a voice called from behind the fence. "You're up early, Remy." I turned. A man stood on the subdivision side of the property line, leaning casually on the top rail of the fence as though watching a sunrise show he didn't pay to attend. I recognized him. He'd been the one posing for my camera yesterday, the guy in the bright orange kayak who waved like we were old friends. He wore a down jacket and a smug grin that irritated me more than the cold. "Bethany told everyone the lake access would stay open," he said. "She's handling the paperwork, so no need to stress about it." My fingers tightened around my phone. "There is no paperwork that gives you rights to this lake." He shrugged. "Well, that's not what she said, and that sign looks pretty official to me." I bit down on the words I wanted to say. Not because he was right, but because arguments weren't evidence. This wasn't the place to debate. It was a place to observe, record, hoard, build. "Enjoy your morning," he added, pushing off the fence and strolling back toward the subdivision, like this was all settled. His breath left small puffs in the air, fading just as quickly as the small doubts I thought I could give Bethany. I stared after him for a few seconds longer, then turned and walked back up the slope toward my cabin. The moment I crossed the porch, I grabbed my landline phone and dialed the number I'd been saving for when things got serious. Sarah Mitchell picked up on the third ring. "Morning, Remy." I exhaled slowly. "Sarah, I need you to come out to the lake." "What happened?" "They put up a sign, an official-looking one." There was a pause on the other end, the kind where a lawyer recalculates the situation in real time. "They posted it on your property?" "Right on my gate." "Send me a picture." I did. 30 seconds passed. Then she spoke again, slower this time. "That's bold. That's one word. Give me an hour." She hung up. I set the phone down, walked back outside, and let the cold wind hit me in the face like a slap designed to wake me up. My breath came out in thick clouds. A few geese glided low across the lake, their wings skimming the water and leaving faint ripples that dissolved into the morning light. This was supposed to be peaceful, a simple lake retreat, a quiet property at the end of a long road. Instead, it felt like someone had thrown open a door I never asked them to open and started rearranging the furniture inside. An hour later, a silver SUV pulled up the gravel path. Sarah stepped out, the wind catching her dark hair and whipping it across her coat collar. She wasn't dressed like a courtroom attorney today, not in her usual sharp blazer, but in a thick jacket and boots, the kind that could handle rough ground and stubborn problems. She walked straight to the gate, examined the sign, bent close to check the bolts. Her breath fogged the metal. "This wasn't done by a handyman," she said. "It's standard HOA signage, manufactured, ordered, installed with intent." I crossed my arms. Intent for what? She looked up at me, her dark eyes narrowing. Control. The wind picked up again, rattling the chain the sign hung from. It clinked in the cold air, a metallic warning. Sarah pulled a folded map from her bag, the original Subdivision plat. She spread it across the hood of her SUV, smoothing the edges with her palms. "Your lake," she tapped one corner of the map, "is fully outside the Willow Bay boundary. No easements, no shared access, no rights. This sign is unlawful." "So what now?" She studied the gate for a long moment. "We build your case." The chill in my chest shifted, less like cold, more like clarity, a direction. She took out her camera and snapped photos, angles matching mine in precision. "Don't take the sign down yet," she said. "It's evidence." "Evidence of what?" She looked at me again, this time with something new in her expression. Gravity. "Evidence," she said quietly, "of violation, and possibly fraud." The wind hissed along the lake's surface, pushing tiny waves against the stones with soft, rhythmic slaps. A storm gathered somewhere behind the ridge, the clouds thickening, darkening, the kind that covered light and revealed truth. I watched Sarah take her last photo and tuck her camera away. This wasn't just trespassing anymore. This was the first real crack in the wall they didn't expect me to push back against. And as I looked again at the sign, hard, cold, definitive, I felt the day change around me, heavier and sharper than before. They had made their move. Now it was my turn. But turning didn't mean charging forward. Not out here. Not against an HOA that clearly believed confidence could replace law. What I needed wasn't confrontation. It was precision. By the time Sarah drove away, the clouds had thickened over the ridge, rolling in with the color of damp steel. A storm was coming, the kind that wrapped the whole valley in silence. I stood for a while at the edge of the lake, letting the cold wind press against my jacket, smelling the shift in the air, the wetness, the pine sap, the static that always hummed before snowfall. "Silence," Sarah had said before leaving, "isn't weakness, it's strategy." So I walked back toward the cabin, boots sinking softly into the thawing earth, and began the first step of my own move: documentation. Inside, the old wood stove popped as I fed it another log. Heat spread slowly through the one-room cabin, warming the knots in the timber walls. My laptop sat on the rough-cut table by the window, the view beyond it framed perfectly. Lake, gate, trespassers waiting to happen. I opened the laptop, the hinges creaking a little, and pulled up the files I'd begun organizing. Date, time, footage, photos, notes, everything needed to be perfect. The storm reached the lake about an hour later, snowflakes drifting down like bits of ash. They dusted the sign, softening its edges until the cold metal looked almost out of place in the white hush. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside again, moving through the quiet as if stepping into a photograph. The trail cameras had already begun their work. A red LED blinked every few seconds on the one strapped to the pine. I checked its battery, adjusted its angle slightly, and tapped the screen to view the last captured image. Someone, likely the man from the fence, had walked past just after Sarah left. He hadn't stepped onto my property this time, but he had stood there long enough to stare at the sign and nod before turning around. A nod. Approval. Coordination. I pocketed the camera card and moved on to the second device near the trail from the subdivision. Snow collected in my hair and beard as I worked, the wind whistling low through the branches above. The trees creaked with the weight of the coming storm, their bark damp and dark. The lake itself had taken on a muted gray sheen, like it was listening. Back inside, I uploaded the fresh footage. Each clip painted a clearer picture. Patterns, habits, confidence without justification. People walking the path like they were strolling through a park. Kids cutting across the tall grass. Two women dragging collapsible tables. A man carrying a sack of charcoal briquettes. All of it would matter later. For now, I needed more than footage. I needed maps. I grabbed the deed folder, thick, stiff parchment, the pages smelling faintly of ink and time, and spread it across the table. The legal description was exact. Section numbers, township references, boundary markers that matched the county map line for line. The lake fell wholly inside the parcel. No shared rights, no community easements, no boundary disputes. I took a pen and sketched out the perimeter on tracing paper, marking the key areas. The path from the subdivision, the slope above the shoreline, the line of white pines that separated my land from theirs. The storm tapped against the window as I worked, the soft patter of snow like fingers on glass. Each line I drew steadied something in me. Not because I doubted my ownership, I didn't. But because I understood now that this fight wouldn't be won with raised voices or shouted warnings. It would be won with inches, dates, times, coordinates, hard facts laid out like fence posts that no HOA tradition could knock down. Around mid-afternoon, the storm picked up, the flakes falling thicker, the air turning heavy with cold. I opened the door to look outside. Everything was white, muted, still. Even the sign on the gate looked subdued beneath the layer of snow settling across its surface. But beneath the quiet, I felt movement, like the ground itself was bracing for what came next. I grabbed my drone from its case on the shelf, brushed off a thin layer of dust, and stepped back into the cold. The wind tugged at my coat, swirling snow across the porch steps. I launched the drone from the flat stone near the gate, its propellers cutting through the frozen air with a soft whir. The live feed came up on my phone screen. The lake below, vast and untouched. The trail cameras blinking red. The subdivision road winding up the hill like a vein feeding trouble into the water. I guided the drone up, tracing the edges of the lake with slow, intentional passes. The stone outcroppings, the shallows, the narrow inlet where the water fed the marsh. All mine, all legally documented. By the third pass, something new caught my eye on the subdivision side of the fence. Footprints again. Fresh ones, forming a small pattern, a pause, a step back, then a turn toward the main road. Someone had come here today, even in a storm. They were watching, too, as the drone hovered in the cold air, its camera freezing the moment in digital clarity. I felt the shift inside me again. Less like irritation, more like alignment, like gears clicking into place. Silence was no longer just strategy. It was advantage. I brought the drone down, its landing legs touching the snow-covered grass with a soft crunch. Then I gathered the maps, footage, and notes into a neat pile on the table. Everything organized like a case file waiting to be opened. Beside the paperwork, I placed one more item, the deed. Its weight felt heavier now, not because it had changed, but because the situation had. I looked down at the collection of facts laid out before me, the foundation of something stronger than anger. Let Bethany talk about tradition. Let them set up kayaks and coolers and foldable tables. Let them pretend they owned what they didn't. Paperwork would do the talking soon enough. And when it did, the lake would speak louder than any HOA sign ever could. The storm lifted overnight. By dawn, a thin crust of snow clung to the shoreline, glowing faintly under the pale winter sun. The air had that sharp, metallic bite Wyoming mornings carried after a long freeze. I stepped outside with a mug of hot coffee and let the cold settle into my lungs. The lake looked untouched, quiet, silver, still. If you didn't know better, you'd think nothing had happened here at all. But the gate remained. The sign remained, and the weight of their arrogance clung to the air as stubbornly as the frost on the pine needles. I had barely taken 2 sips when the crunch of tires broke through the morning quiet. A delivery truck rumbled up the gravel road, stopped near the porch, and a man in a thick jacket stepped out holding a clipboard and a certified mail envelope. "Remy Cole?" he called. "That's me." He handed me the envelope, made me sign, and walked off without another word. The truck disappeared down the hill, its taillights flickering between the branches. I looked down at the envelope. The return address read, Willow Bay Homeowners Association, Compliance Division. The absurdity of those words printed together, Compliance Division, sent a flash of heat through my chest. I carried the envelope to the porch railing, set my coffee aside, and tore it open carefully. Inside was a neatly folded letter, printed on heavyweight paper, with the HOA logo in blue ink at the top. I unfolded it slowly, almost reverently, the way you unroll a map that might lead to trouble. The words were crisp, deliberate. Notice of violation. Obstruction of community access, daily fine, $200. I read the letter twice, then a third time. According to them, I was impeding established community rights by blocking access to the Willow Bay recreational water feature. They accused me of interfering with communal use, of tampering with HOA signage, and, this one almost made me laugh, of creating a hostile environment for residents attempting to enjoy the lake. There was a line at the bottom, bolded, "Failure to comply will result in immediate escalation to legal action and enforcement measures. Enforcement measures." That phrase sat heavy in my hands like something sour. A cold wind blew across the porch, rustling the paper, carrying the sharp scent of snow and lake water. I felt my jaw tighten, not from anger, not yet, but from something older, deeper, a shift from irritation to certainty. They had crossed into territory no HOA should ever enter. I walked back inside and called Sarah. She picked up immediately. "Tell me you're not calling because something got worse." They sent a violation notice. "Trespassing again?" Printed, signed, certified mail. I read the opening lines to her. There was a long silence on the line. Then, in a tone that hadn't been there yesterday, she said, "They screwed up." "What do you mean?" "You can't issue legal threats over land you don't govern. That's more than overreach. It's impersonation of authority. It's a violation of state statute. And depending on how they worded it," I heard papers rustle as she typed something, "it may also qualify as attempted extortion." The word fell into the room like a dropped hammer. Extortion. The cabin seemed to grow quieter around me, the crackle of the wood stove suddenly far away. Outside, the gate creaked softly in the waking wind. "Save everything," Sarah said. "Don't touch the sign. Don't respond. Don't engage with them. I want photos of the envelope, the postmark, the letterhead. Then I'm coming over." I set the phone down and took a slow breath. The air tasted like wood smoke and cold pine. My eyes drifted back to the letter still lying on the table. So official looking, so confident, so wrong. I took the pictures one by one. Envelope front, envelope back, stamps, seal, letterhead, paragraphs, the signature line. Each click of the camera tightened a coil inside me. Then I walked outside again. The metal sign glinted in the morning light, a thin layer of frost hugging its surface. I crouched to photograph the bolts, the angles, the path of footsteps leading away. The lake reflected the sky, soft and silver, as if waiting patiently for the truth to surface. When Sarah arrived, she stepped out of her SUV with a look that told me everything. "This isn't just some HOA flex," she said, striding toward the porch. "This is a paper trail of misconduct." I handed her the letter. She read it once, then again, eyes narrowing. "Remy," she said quietly, "they just handed you the strongest leverage you could ask for. This isn't a warning. It's a confession." "A confession of what?" I asked. "Of pretending your land is under their authority, of threatening legal penalties without jurisdiction." She tapped the letter with a gloved finger. "In Wyoming, that's a felony-level mistake." The wind pushed a wave of cold air across the porch, making the wooden boards creak. Sarah glanced at the gate, then the lake, then the trail leading up to the subdivision. "They thought they were playing a community game," she said. "They thought this was about posturing." "But it's not," I said. "No," she answered. "It's about property law, real law. And they just picked a fight with the one person they shouldn't have." Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then looked up at me. "We need to file this. Today." Inside the cabin, the stove gave a low pop as the wood settled deeper into the flames. I stood by the window, watching snowflakes drift lazily down from a sky that had started to darken again. For the first time since the gate appeared, the tension in my chest shifted, unwinding slightly, like the tightening coil was beginning to reverse. They thought a letter would scare me. Instead, it opened the door they never wanted opened. And now, with Sarah by my side, the lake no longer felt like a place waiting to be defended. It felt like a case waiting to be won. The next morning broke with a low fog drifting across the surface of the lake, spreading like a slow-moving tide of white that swallowed the shoreline. The world looked muted, water, sky, and snow blending into a single pale canvas. Only the dark outline of the unauthorized gate cut through the haze like a splinter. I lit the stove, ate a spare breakfast, and waited for Sarah. She'd promised to return early with whatever she'd pulled from the county's database overnight. I didn't expect what she actually brought. Her SUV rolled into the driveway just after 9. When she stepped out, she was carrying a flat, weatherproof case, longer than a file box, shorter than a tool chest, the kind of case you only bring when things are about to get serious. "Morning," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her eyes as the wind swept across the yard. "Hope you're ready." "For what?" "For clarity." She walked straight past me, boots crunching across the frost-covered ground, and set the case on the hood of my truck. When she flipped the latches, the sound echoed across the empty lake like the snap of a trap resetting. Inside the case lay a series of rolled maps, a bound packet, and a flash drive. She pulled out the largest map first, an original county plat printed on heavy archival paper, its edges slightly yellowed, its lines crisp in black ink. "Remy," she said, smoothing it open across the hood. "This is the subdivision plan for Willow Bay, the one filed with the county clerk 15 years ago." The map showed the familiar puzzle piece layout of the subdivision, twisting roads, cul-de-sacs, parcels shaped like irregular quadrilaterals. But the lake, my lake, sat outside all of it, not even touching. A full 50 feet of woodland separated it from their boundary. I traced the line with my finger. They said it was always an amenity. It never was. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had checked this fact more than once. "And here's more." She handed me the bound packet, survey reports, tax assessment records, land certifications dating back decades. I flipped through each page, the sound of crisp paper slicing the quiet air. Every document said the same thing. The lake was private, always had been. Owned by the rancher before me, not the HOA, not the subdivision, not the community. I looked back at the map. There's no easement. No shared access, she confirmed. No rights of way. No implied rights either. No legal claim of any kind. Exactly. She slid a second document across the hood. And now, for the part they really won't like. The sheet was a scanned copy of the HOA bylaws. Highlighted in yellow was a clause reading, "The Willow Bay Homeowners Association shall have no jurisdiction beyond the subdivision boundary, nor claim authority over adjacent private lands." Another page highlighted in green read, "No structure, signage, enforcement action, or common area designation may be applied outside HOA-owned property." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. They broke their own bylaws by putting that sign up. They broke county code by installing anything on private land. And with that letter, I held up the notice of violation lying on the truck seat. They crossed into felony territory. Sarah nodded. Impersonation of legal authority, threatening financial penalties on property they don't govern, and depending on how they try to justify it, attempted encroachment. The wind picked up, tugging at the corners of the map. I held it down with my palm, feeling the rough texture of the paper. The lake behind us rippled softly, as if listening. "How do we use this?" I asked. "We don't have to use anything yet," she said. "The sheriff's office will." She reached into her pocket and unfolded a small slip of paper. On it was a handwritten note. "Deputy Marcus Hale will arrive at 11 unth." Marcus Hale. I knew the name. Everyone in the county did. He wasn't the type to pick sides lightly. "He's already reviewed the violation letter," Sarah said. "He called the county attorney this morning. They want to see the sign in person." As if on cue, a low rumble echoed from the distance, the crunch of tires on the gravel road. Sarah and I both turned. A county sheriff's SUV rounded the bend, headlights cutting through the mist, engine humming steadily. It stopped beside my truck, and the engine shut off. A moment later, Marcus Hale stepped out, tall and solidly built, wearing a tan jacket and the kind of expression that said he'd been doing this job long enough to recognize trouble before hearing a single word. "Morning, Remy," he said with a nod. "Deputy." He glanced at Sarah. "Counsel." She returned the nod. "Deputy." Marcus walked toward the gate with slow, deliberate steps, hands resting on his belt, breath fogging in the cold. He stood before the sign, eyes narrowing slightly as he examined the bolts, the logo, the placement. "This is on your parcel?" he asked without looking back. "Yes," I said. He crouched, ran a gloved hand along the bottom of the gate frame, brushing aside snow to reveal the screws driven into the soil. When he straightened, he exhaled sharply. "They put this up themselves." Sarah handed him the violation letter. "And then they sent this." Marcus read it in silence. When he finished, he folded the letter and slid it into his jacket pocket. "This is not a civil matter," he said. Something tightened inside my chest. "Meaning what?" "Meaning," Marcus said, turning to face me, "I'll be speaking with the HOA president today, and she won't like the conversation." The wind blew again, sharp, cold, cutting through the space between us. Snow drifted across the path in thin ribbons. Marcus turned back to the sign. "This stays up," he said. "It's evidence." Sarah nodded. "We've got photos, drone footage, multiple timestamps." "Good," he replied. "Because this is bigger than a boundary dispute, and someone's been playing landlord on a property they don't own." He stepped back toward his SUV. "I'll be back this afternoon. Expect questions. And keep your cameras running." The doors shut. The engine roared to life, and the sheriff's vehicle disappeared into the fog. The silence that followed was heavy, layered with truth, law, and something colder than lake water. Sarah rolled up the maps and slid them back into her case. "I told you," she said gently. "They crossed a line." I looked out across the lake. The gray water, the thin mist, the quiet stillness. My land. My lake. My rights. The deed sat on the table behind me, heavy with meaning. Everything had changed. The lake was no longer a question. It was an answer. By late afternoon, the fog that had blanketed the lake finally lifted, peeling back layer by layer until the water lay exposed beneath a wide Wyoming sky. Thin streaks of sunlight pierced the clouds, glinting off the small ripples drifting across the surface. The storm had passed, but the cold that remained carried a different kind of weight, a quiet before something heavier. I spent most of the day pacing the shoreline, checking camera angles, tightening straps, and filing the morning's footage into clean digital folders. Every step felt deliberate, measured. The lake had never needed defending before, but now it needed documenting. And around 4 o'clock, the gravel road answered back. A vehicle crested the hill, its engine low and steady, tires rolling over frozen ground with the sound of crunching glass. I looked up from the edge of the dock, the wind brushing cold across my cheeks. The sheriff's SUV slowed, then stopped in front of the cabin. This time, it wasn't just Marcus Hale stepping out. Another deputy climbed out behind him, a younger man whose face I recognized from a few county meetings. He held a tablet tucked under one arm. Marcus, with his broad shoulders and stern calm, moved with the practiced rhythm of someone who didn't rush unless he had to. The two of them approached the porch. Marcus stopped at the bottom of the steps and tipped his hat. "Afternoon, Remy." "Deputy," I said, "you're back sooner than I expected." "Would have been here earlier," he replied, "but I had some enlightening conversations up in the subdivision." He didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth tightened. That told me everything. Sarah, who had stayed through the afternoon to help organize the paperwork, stepped out of the cabin behind me. The air smelled like wood smoke and cold earth, the kind of scent that settled deep into winter. Marcus turned his gaze toward the gate in the distance. "Let's go take a look." We walked together down the gravel path. Snow crunched beneath our boots, slipping in some spots where the sun had failed to reach. A flock of geese flew low overhead, wings slicing the air with soft, rhythmic thumps. When we reached the gate, Marcus rested a hand on the cold wooden post. "You see this?" he asked the younger deputy. "Yes, sir." "This is private land." "Yes, sir." "And yet someone installed a sign claiming authority that doesn't exist." The deputy nodded again, tapping a note on his tablet. Sarah stepped to Marcus's side. "The letter adds to it. It shows clear intent to impose regulations where they have none." "We're treating that letter seriously," Marcus said, glancing at me. "I spoke with Bethany." "How'd that go?" I asked. He huffed softly through his nose, a sound halfway between amusement and disbelief. "She tried to call this a misunderstanding, claimed the HOA had historic use rights, claimed the community has always considered the lake part of their amenities, claimed," he paused, "that you were the one escalating." I breathed out slowly, letting the cold air sting my lungs. "And what did you tell her?" "That historic use doesn't mean legal use, and that issuing fines for land outside their authority is illegal." He paused. "She didn't like that." "I imagine not." Marcus crouched again at the gate, brushing away the snow near the bolts, examining the tracks we'd both seen earlier. "This wasn't one person," he said. "Different treads, multiple visitors, coordinated." He stood and turned to face the lake. The water was shifting shades of blue and slate under the dimming sky. "Remy," he said, "you've been patient, more than most, and it's good you documented everything. People think these cases turn on who raises their voice the loudest. They don't. They turn on details." I figured as much. The deputy spoke for the first time. "Sir, should we open a formal trespassing investigation?" Marcus glanced at Sarah, then at me. "What do you think?" Sarah answered. "I think we give them enough rope to tie their own knot." Marcus nodded. "I agree." Then he looked at me, his gaze steady. "I've issued them a warning. Not a slap on the wrist, not a suggestion, a formal notice. They're not allowed to set foot on your land unless you invite them." "And if they ignore it?" I asked. "Then this stays out of HOA drama," he said, "and enters criminal territory." A cold wind swept across the water, rippling it like brushed steel. The sign clinked softly, a hollow little sound that seemed smaller than it had earlier. Marcus's expression sharpened, and Remy, more residents are starting to ask questions. Real questions. Some didn't know the lake wasn't theirs. That caught me off guard. How did they not know? "That's the thing," Marcus said. "Bethany's been telling them otherwise for years, unofficially, casually, enough times to blend fiction with familiarity." Beside him, the younger deputy added, "Some of them looked genuinely surprised. One even said, 'But she promised we'd always have lake rights.'" Sarah blew a slow breath into the cold air. Promises she had no authority to make. "Exactly," Marcus said. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I'm headed back up to speak with a few more board members. Off the record. People are nervous. And when people get nervous, they talk." He tucked his gloves into his jacket pocket. "You stay here. Keep recording. Let the cameras do their work." "And the sign?" I asked. "It stays," he said firmly. "It's your best visual evidence of trespass and false authority." The younger deputy handed me a card. "If you see anyone step past that gate," he said, "call us. Immediately." The two deputies walked back up the path, their figures silhouetted against the fading winter light. When the SUV engine started, its rumble echoed across the lake and up into the thinning sky. I stood by the gate long after they left. The wind blew harder now, cold enough to cut, pulling dried pine needles across the snow in tiny spirals. The lake had turned darker, reflecting the storm-gray clouds gathering again near the western ridge. Sarah stepped beside me. "Marcus is good," she said softly. "He doesn't get involved unless he believes someone's being wronged." "I know," I said. "That helps." She looked toward the Subdivision trail, and I think the HOA just realized this won't be the quiet little intimidation game they expected. The wind rattled the sign again, once, sharply, like the final tap of a gavel. The ridge across the lake glowed faintly under the last stretch of daylight, painting the snow-covered trees in muted gold. "This lake," Sarah said, "is going to expose everything." I kept my eyes on the gate, the sign, the footprints just visible beneath the melting snow. "I think," I said quietly, "it already has." The following days proved it. The storm that swept through Wyoming overnight left the ground brittle and glittering under a thin crust of frost. By morning, the sun had carved narrow beams of light across the lake, revealing the long scars of footprints from the subdivision, tracks leading to my shoreline, then retreating back through the trees like restless shadows. But that wasn't the only thing exposed. By 8 o'clock, the texts began. First from Dawn, the retired firefighter who lived at the edge of Willow Bay. "Is it true the HOA's been telling us the lake was part of the subdivision?" Then Felicia, a nurse who often waved at me when driving past the ridge. "We were never shown the original plat. Bethany told us access was included in our dues." Then another message, then 5 more. until my phone buzzed like a trapped hornet in my pocket. Word traveled faster through Willow Bay than the wind across my lake. By mid-morning, I heard the first raised voices from the Subdivision trail. They carried across the cold air, angry, confused, clipped by the kind of betrayal that cracked the community facade wide open. She said the lake was ours. Dues paid for upkeep. Where did the money even go? My realtor promised access. If she lied about this, what else? I stood on the porch, hands resting on the railing worn smooth by years of weather, watching the trail as clusters of residents appeared, their breaths clouding in the cold. They weren't heading for the lake this time. They were heading for the HOA clubhouse, a beige building with too many windows and a roof that never quite blended into the mountain skyline. Even from my property, I could see movement around it, people gathering, pacing, gesturing with stiff arms. A meeting was already happening, and it wasn't scheduled. Sarah arrived just before noon, boots kicking up thin dustings of frost as she crossed toward me. "It started," she said. "Started?" "The unraveling." The lake behind us was calm, eerily so, as though the world had paused to watch. She stood beside me at the porch railing, her breath rising in thin white wisps. "3 HOA board members called the county this morning," she said. "They wanted to clarify the lake situation. When the county told them the truth, they walked out of the HOA office. Resigned. Effective immediately." I let out a low whistle. "That's quick." "When people realize they've been used," Sarah said, "they don't like staying in the same room as the person who used them." We headed down toward the lake, boots crunching the frozen earth. The sun hung low over the ridge, painting the snow in shades of pale gold. The gate, still standing, still illegal, cast a narrow shadow across the path. "It won't last," Sarah murmured. "What won't?" "Their unity, their story, their power." A sudden burst of voices rose from the trail. We turned. A group of residents approached, 5, maybe 6 of them. Some carried folded documents. Others clutched thick envelopes. Don was at the front, his face flushed with cold and a different heat entirely. "Remy," he called, waving as he reached the boundary fence. "We need to talk." I walked to meet them, stopping at my side of the line. The air between us felt charged, heavy with things they hadn't known, things they were beginning to piece together. "We didn't know," Don said. "Not about the lake, not about any of this." Felicia stepped forward. "She told us the lake was part of our dues, that we maintained it, that we had rights to it." "You don't," Sarah said gently, stepping beside me. Felicia nodded. "We know that now. Marcus showed us the maps." The man at the back, one I hadn't seen before, held up a thick packet. "There's a petition," he said. "Enough signatures for a recall vote. Maybe more." The wind shifted, pushing a cold ripple across the lake. "What happened in your meeting?" I asked. Dawn's jaw tightened. "She denied everything. Said you were trying to take something from us. Said we were being manipulated." He paused. "But the more she talked, the less sense it made." Felicia nodded. "She got nervous, defensive. He started asking questions about dues, where the money goes, why our statements didn't match the improvements she claimed she made." The man with the packet stepped closer, lowering his voice. 3 board members quit on the spot. One went straight to the sheriff's office. "And Bethany?" I asked. "She's fighting," Don said. "Hard, but she's slipping." Another wave of voices rolled down the trail, more residents approaching the clubhouse, more tension spilling into the cold air. The entire subdivision felt different now, restless and raw, a community waking up. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "Nothing," Felicia said softly. "Just the truth, and maybe permission." Permission. Don cleared his throat. We're organizing a vote this afternoon. Emergency recall. The bylaws allow it. And most of us don't want to be part of whatever she dragged us into. I looked at them, faces tired, frustrated, uncertain. Not enemies, not trespassers, at least not knowingly. Just people caught in the wake of someone else's ambition. You have my support, I said. Relief washed over the group like a gust of warm air. They thanked me one by one, then headed back up toward the clubhouse where more residents gathered in a tight knot of bodies and murmurs. Sarah stood beside me watching them go. Communities don't fall apart because of one bad leader, she said. They fall apart because the truth finally catches up. And this truth? I asked. It's moving fast. A cold gust swept across the lake, carrying the faint echoes of raised voices from the clubhouse. Papers rustled. Doors slammed. Someone called for order. Someone else demanded answers. And then silence. A drawn-out, uneasy silence that stretched all the way across the ridge. When the sound finally broke again, it came as a ripple through the air, small at first, then growing. Applause. Not joyous, not victorious, but firm, decisive. A verdict delivered by the people who'd been misled the longest. Sarah turned to me, her expression calm but certain. The board fell apart today, she said, and she knows it. The wind shifted, rattling the illegal HOA sign on my gate one last time before dying away into stillness. She won't go quietly, I murmured. No, Sarah agreed. People like her never do. The sky above the lake faded into hues of deepening blue as the afternoon slipped toward dusk. The world whispered with cold, with change, with the slow creaking of a structure collapsing under the weight of its own lies. A shift had begun in Willow Bay, and deep down, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. This wasn't the end. Not yet. The next morning rose colder than any before it, the kind of cold that seeped into the seams of the cabin and whispered along the floorboards. The lake was still, a sheet of pale glass beneath a washed-out Wyoming sunrise. The storm clouds had finally drifted east, leaving behind a brittle calm, the kind that comes only after something has broken. And something had. The news reached me before the sun cleared the ridge. A knock on the door, firm, steady, unmistakable. I wrapped my flannel around my shoulders and opened it to find Marcus standing on the porch, his breath fogging in the crisp air. "Morning, Remy," he said. "Rough night?" I asked. "For them," he replied. He stepped inside, removing his hat and brushing off the frost. Sarah arrived moments later, her hair still damp from the early shower, files tucked under her arm. The three of us gathered around the table, the same table where the deed had once laid, where the violation letter had sat like a spark, waiting for fuel. Marcus placed a folder down, thick, heavy. "Bethany's actions caught up with her," he said. "The board held the recall vote last night. Overwhelming majority." "She's out?" I asked. "Out," he confirmed. "Effective immediately. The residents have dissolved her authority pending investigation." Sarah exhaled, the tension flashing briefly across her face before fading. "And the lake?" Marcus opened the folder. Inside was a notarized document stamped by the county, fresh ink still bold on the page. "Willow Bay HOA formal acknowledgement of private ownership." The words felt like a stone dropping clean through the air, heavy, final. "This," Marcus said, tapping the page, "is your protection going forward. The new acting board signed it unanimously. They disavow all claims of access, control, or jurisdiction." "Good," I murmured. "That's exactly what needed to happen." He nodded. "You also have grounds for civil damages. The county attorney is reviewing the extent." Sarah stepped closer, spreading out the acknowledgement. This ends it, she said. Legally, publicly, permanently. The morning sun broke over the ridge then, casting lines of gold across the cabin floor, hitting the edge of the document just right so its seal shone like a coin. But even victory carried echoes. What about Bethany? I asked quietly. She won't be back to your lake, Marcus said. And judging from last night, she won't be running any boards for a long time. He hesitated, then added, People are angry, Remy. Not at you, at her, at the lies. Some of them paid fines she never filed properly. Some believed access they never had. They're demanding a full audit. I absorbed his words slowly. The weight of it settled like snow on the pines, soft but deep. After Marcus left, Sarah lingered, looking out the window at the lake. You did everything right? She said. Did I? I asked, half smiling. Yes, she said firmly. You didn't yell. You didn't confront them. You didn't escalate. You documented. You stayed patient. And you let the truth do the work. I breathed in the scent of wood smoke as the stove crackled. The wind outside brushed against the porch rail, barely bending the frost-covered pine needles. Feels strange, I admitted. Winning by stillness. Stillness isn't weakness, she replied. Sometimes it's the most powerful move. She gathered her things, pulling her coat tight. If you need me again, call. But I think, for now, you can enjoy your lake the way you meant to. When she left, the cabin felt different, lighter, quieter. I stepped outside onto the porch. The cold bit my face, but the air felt cleaner. The path to the subdivision lay empty. No kayaks, no coolers, no chatter drifting across the water. The gate still stood, but it looked small now, insignificant. Its sign hung crooked, frost collecting in the corners, no longer a threat, just evidence of a chapter that had finally closed. I walked down to the dock, hands tucked into my coat, boots crunching softly over frozen earth. The lake mirrored the sky, a blend of pale blue and winter white. I sat at the edge of the dock, letting my legs dangle above the water. For a long moment, I just listened. No footsteps, no voices, no uninvited boats cutting through the surface. Only the hush of the wind gliding over the lake. The soft groan of the dock settling against its posts, the faint rustle of dried grasses shaking in the cold. This place, this water, this quiet, was mine again. Later that afternoon, I took down the illegal HOA sign with a screwdriver and steady hands. The bolts squeaked as I loosened them, metal grinding softly against metal, until the sign dropped into my gloves with a dull, defeated weight. I carried it back to the cabin and leaned it against the wall beside the stove, a reminder of a battle fought without raising my voice. The gate itself I left standing, not because I wanted it, because someday I might point to it and remember exactly how entitlement crumbles in the face of truth. As the sun dipped lower, the lake shimmered like glass catching fire, turning gold, then orange, then a deep ember red. Shadows stretched long across the water, quiet and soft. I sat on the dock again with a cup of hot coffee, letting the steam warm my face as the cold pressed in gently around me. The lake didn't feel invaded anymore. It felt restored, untouched. Right, when the last sliver of sunlight slid behind the ridge, I whispered something I hadn't said aloud since the day I bought this place. Home. The lake responded in the only way it ever knew how. With quiet water, gentle wind, and a truth no HOA sign could ever replace. Sometimes standing your ground is quiet work, but it still matters. If you've ever dealt with an HOA or fought for what's yours, drop a simple justice in the comments. And if you'd like more stories about land, grit, and doing what's right, feel free to subscribe and stick around. The porch light's always on here.